Welcome back to SCOTUS Oral Arguments and Opinions. Today we're tackling a nuanced but easy to follow personal jurisdiction case, Coney Island Auto Parts versus Burton. Our apologies, in our last episode, we mentioned that today's episode will feature Landor versus Louisiana Department of Corrections. However, we'll feature Landor in our next episode.
One more bit of housekeeping. What do you think of the new podcast picture? Love it? Like it? Hate it? Let me know. Your feedback is highly appreciated. Okay, let's talk Coney Island, a time-trapped tangle. This case presents what seems like a straightforward question about civil procedure, but it cuts to the heart of something fundamental. When a court lacks jurisdiction and enters a judgment anyway, can that void judgment actually become legally valid just because time passes?
Let me break that down. When we say a court lacks jurisdiction, we mean it doesn't have legal authority over the parties or the subject matter, like a Tennessee court trying to decide a case involving someone who was never properly notified and has no connection to Tennessee. A void judgment means the court's decision lacks legal force or effect from the moment it was entered. It's as if the judgment never existed at all.
Right. And here's what makes this fascinating. We've got a circuit split where every circuit except the Sixth Circuit says, no, void means void no, matter the amount of time that elapses. But the Sixth Circuit said, void means valid after a reasonable time passes. The Supreme Court granted cert to settle this once and for all.
And the practical stakes are huge. We're talking about default judgments where people never got proper notice, courts that lacked jurisdiction from day one, and the fundamental question of whether procedural rules can essentially validate what should never have existed in the first place.
Plus, this affects every federal court in the country, every bankruptcy court, every district court. They all use Rule 60 to handle these situations. So whatever the court decides here will ripple through thousands of cases.
So let's start with the precise question the court agreed to review. Coney Island asks whether Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 60C1 imposes any time limit to set aside a default judgment void for lack of personal jurisdiction.
Now, to understand what's at stake, we need to look at the key rule that's causing all this controversy. Rule 60B4 says courts can grant relief from a judgment that is void. Pretty straightforward. If a judgment is void, courts can vacate it. But here's where it gets tricky. Rule 60C1 says that any motion under Rule 60B must be made within a reasonable time. So the question becomes, does that reasonable time requirement apply to void judgments under Rule 60B4?
Wait, so you're telling me that the rule literally says any motion under Rule 60B, and Rule 60B4 is part of Rule 60B? That seems pretty clear textually. A clean, straightforward reading means that even void judgments become valid after a reasonable amount of time elapses. The position the Sixth Circuit follows.
That's exactly Burton's argument. But Coney Island says, hold on, void judgments are special. They argue that something that never had legal validity can't suddenly become valid just because time passes. It's like saying a contract signed by a minor becomes enforceable if you wait long enough.
That's a fascinating analogy, but Burton pushes back and says, we're not making void judgments valid. We're just putting procedural requirements on how you challenge them. There's a difference between saying, this judgment is now valid, and saying, you waited too long to use this particular procedural mechanism. So let's walk through what actually happened here, because the facts really illustrate why this matters. VistaPro Automotive was an auto parts company in Nashville that filed for bankruptcy. Gene Burton became the Chapter 7 trustee tasked with collecting money for creditors.
In February 2015, the Tennessee Bankruptcy Court entered a default judgment against Coney Island Auto Parts for about $48,000. Coney Island claims they never received proper service of process, meaning they didn't know about the lawsuit and couldn't defend themselves.
And here's the key legal point. If Coney Island is right about improper service, then the Tennessee court lacked personal jurisdiction. Under centuries of Supreme Court precedent, a judgment entered without personal jurisdiction is void from the moment it's entered.
But here's where the story gets really interesting. Nothing happened for over 5 years. Then in July 2020, Burton registered the Tennessee judgment in New York so she could collect on it there. That's when Coney Island's bank account got frozen for nearly $100,000.
Wait, frozen for twice the judgment amount?
Right. Under New York law, they can freeze twice the judgment amount as security. So suddenly, Coney Island's business operations are in jeopardy because of this judgment they claim they never knew about.
So, in October 2021, Coney Island finally files a motion in New York to vacate the Tennessee judgment for lack of personal jurisdiction. But the New York Bankruptcy Court says, not our problem. You need to go back to Tennessee where the judgment was entered.
Which brings us to March 2022, now 7 years after the original judgment, when Coney Island files their Rule 60b-4 motion in Tennessee. The bankruptcy court grants it and vacates the judgment. But the Sixth Circuit reverses, saying 7 years is just too long, even for a void judgment.
And that's what creates our circuit split. The Sixth Circuit said Rule 60 C1's reasonable time requirement applies to all Rule 60B motions, including challenges to void judgments. But every other circuit has said void judgments are special. They can be attacked at any time. The Supreme Court granted certiorari to resolve this split, and you can see why they had to step in. When you have 11 circuits saying one thing and one circuit saying another, that creates massive forum shopping problems and inconsistent results for identical legal issues. Plus, this affects fundamental questions about the finality of judgments and due process rights that the Supreme Court needs to address uniformly across the federal system.
All right, let's break down how each side makes their case. Coney Island's arguments really center on 3 big themes. First, they argue that void judgments simply cannot gain validity through the passage of time. They quote the court's precedent saying a judgment, void for want of jurisdiction, is no judgment at all, and ask, if a judgment is void immediately upon entry, how could the passage of time vivify it?
That's actually a pretty compelling logical argument. They're saying it makes no sense to argue that something that never existed can somehow spring to life just because you wait to challenge it.
Their second argument dives into history and tradition. They claim that for centuries, courts have recognized that void judgments can be challenged at any time. They argue the 1946 advisory committee that created modern Rule 60 never intended to change this fundamental principle.
And they point to statements from advisory committee members suggesting that the reasonable time requirement was meant for voidable judgments, ones that had some legal validity but contained errors, not judgments that were void from the start.
Their third big argument is about judicial consensus. They note that every circuit except the Sixth Circuit recognizes this exception. They argue this shows there's a well-established understanding that void judgments are in a special category. But here's where it gets constitutionally interesting. Coney Island also hints at due process concerns, arguing that enforcing time limits on void judgments could violate the 14th Amendment because it would give legal effect to judgments that never should have existed.
Now, Burton's response is fascinating because it's primarily textual. She says the rule's language is unambiguous. A motion under Rule 60B must be made within a reasonable time. Rule 60b-4 is part of Rule 60b, so the time limit applies. End of story. That's the beauty of a plain text argument. It's hard to argue with what the rule actually says. Burton emphasizes that every tool of statutory interpretation supports requiring time limits for Rule 60b-4 motions.
Burton's second major argument focuses on the rule's structure. She points out that the drafters knew how to create exceptions. They created a special 1-year time limit for certain types of motions under Rule 60b-1, 2, and 3. If they wanted to exempt void judgments, they could have said so explicitly.
And she points to the drafting history to argue that the advisory committee actually rejected a proposal that would have imposed no time limit for void judgments. The committee later agreed that all motions should be made within a reasonable time.
But Burton's most sophisticated argument is about conceptual clarity. She argues that Coney Island conflates 2 separate issues, whether a judgment is void and what procedures you must follow to challenge that judgment.
Right. She's saying the reasonable time requirement doesn't make void judgments valid. It just sets procedural requirements for how you attack them. It's like saying you need to file an appeal within 30 days. That doesn't make the trial court's error disappear, it just sets timing requirements for challenging it.
Burton also argues that Coney Island's approach would create terrible practical problems. She says it would allow parties to engage in flagrantly inequitable conduct by consciously sleeping on their rights in order to cause prejudice to the judgment holder, undermine the finality of long-forgotten judgments, or upset reliance interests.
And she makes this really practical point. If you allow challenges decades later, witnesses die, documents get lost, memories fade. The reasonable time requirement protects against that kind of prejudice while still allowing legitimate challenges when they're brought promptly. So oral arguments are set for November 5th, and I'm really curious to see how the justices handle this tension between textual interpretation and traditional practice.
Right? Because you've got justices who are very committed to plain text interpretation, but you also have this centuries-old tradition that void judgments are special. It'll be interesting to see whether the textualist justices think the rule's plain language overcomes that historical practice. I'm particularly interested in how the justices react to Burton's argument about procedural versus substantive requirements. When she argues that time limits don't validate void judgments, they just impose procedural hurdles. Will the justices buy that distinction?
And I'll be watching for questions about workability. If the court sides with Coney Island, how do you distinguish between truly void judgments and judgments that are just wrong? Do you get endless litigation about whether judgments are void or merely erroneous?
Plus, there's this fascinating question about constitutional avoidance. Coney Island hints that applying time limits to void judgments raises due process concerns. Will the justices want to interpret the rule to avoid those constitutional questions?
The practical consequences could be huge either way. If Coney Island wins, you might see a flood of challenges to old default judgments where parties claim they never got proper notice. If Burton wins, it might encourage more aggressive use of default judgment procedures.
And there's a broader federalism angle here, too. This case involves bankruptcy court judgments, but the principle applies to all federal courts. The court's decision will affect how district courts nationwide handle these challenges.
This case really illustrates how seemingly technical procedural rules can have massive practical consequences. We're talking about the fundamental question of whether courts can give legal effect to judgments they never had authority to enter in the first place.
And it affects some of the most vulnerable parties in the legal system. People who didn't receive proper notice of lawsuits against them, people who couldn't defend themselves because they didn't know they were being sued. The court's decision could determine whether those people have meaningful recourse.
From a broader legal perspective, this case tests how the current court balances textual interpretation against historical practice and practical consequences. Do you follow the rule's plain language even if it disrupts centuries of legal tradition?
Plus, this intersects with ongoing debates about judgment finality and due process. In an era where information travels instantly, but legal notice requirements haven't always kept pace, questions about proper service and personal jurisdiction are increasingly important.
We'll definitely be covering the oral arguments on November 5th, so make sure you're subscribed. This is the kind of case where the justices' questions might give us real insight into how they're thinking about these competing concerns. And when the decision comes down, probably sometime next spring, it's going to affect every federal court in the country and potentially thousands of pending cases. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Coney Island Auto Parts versus Burton.
As always, if you found this helpful, please follow, rate, and share the podcast. As mentioned above, in our next episode, we'll cover Landor versus Louisiana Department of Corrections, a case about whether an individual may sue a government official in his individual capacity for damages for violations of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. If you recall from the summer, this case involves a devout Rastafarian who maintained his religious dreadlocks for nearly 2 decades in accordance with what's called the Nazirite vow, the same biblical oath taken by Samson, only to have a prison guard cut them off. This case will be interesting to cover.
Thank you for listening to SCOTUS Oral Arguments and Opinions. If you enjoyed this episode, follow, rate, and share it. Talk to you soon.